Hi everyone, and welcome to the recorded parts of Lecture 3 for Digital Game Design. I'm going to be talking about introduction and tutorialization today. I may split these videos into intros and then tutorials just to make it a little bit easier. So if I decide to do that, then that's why you'll see two videos instead of one. So what this week looks like is, a set of announcements that we'll deal with in class. Any announcements that I have we'll do in the live sessions, just because I don't know what the lag time is between when I'll be recording these and when you'll be seeing them. So what I have to announce will be potentially a little bit different. But this week is kind of understanding game introductions, talking a little bit about tutorials, and going over some guidelines for designing effective tutorials. And then the in-class discussion piece will probably feature some looks at what we might consider to be good or bad tutorials and what's effective or what's ineffective about them. But before we get into that, let's talk about introductions. And what I mean what I mean when I say introductions is that first, few minutes of the game, the first kind of 5 to 15 minutes, where it's really important to hook the player and get them interested in your game specifically. Now, there's not really one set specific way to do this. There are a lot of ways to create an effective game introduction. You can think about showing the players some interesting visuals that get them excited for what they might see coming up in the game. You could place the player directly into some action sequence that gets them involved at the very onset of what you've created. You could use your game's premise to draw the player into the game world and the story that you're trying to tell. And there are a lot of different ways that you can do this, and there are certainly other options that can help your introduction be more effective. But these are just a few things that you can start thinking about. But it's really important to consider that at the beginning of the game, it's really our job as designers to do the selling of what our game is, to show the player why your game world is interesting, and get the players involved and doing something and just inserting them into that world. It's important to note that players, when they're first starting your game, they don't really know anything about it. It's possible that players might have played a similarly styled game in the past, other games perhaps in the same genre if you're making an FPS or an RTS or whatever. But they don't know any of the specifics about your game and what makes your game unique and special. So it really is, it's our job to teach players about the game and to get them excited to be playing it. And so it is important to explain to them why the game is different from other games that might be similar, and what your game does better than the other games in that genre or in that space in the market. Here I've forgotten to hide a slide, but one of the discussion pieces that we'll be talking about in class is what games we think have good introductions and why they're effective. I'll have a couple for you in this video to get you started thinking, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say as well. Introductions go a long way to managing player interest, right? We've talked, or by the time you see this, we'll have talked about core experiences and what those are for your players. But throughout the introduction and other stages of the game, we still need to keep our players involved and invested. And to that effect, I think it's important to realize that it's not enough to withhold the best parts of your game until the end and just hope that players stick around for that. You need to be able to show your player a good time all throughout the game. And you can still have those important and wow moments, but players have to be invested enough to get to those things. And so the following set of slides, as far as introductions and even the other stages of gameplay are concerned, the following slides are just a couple things to think about for each time frame. And if you want to put a really, I would say, uninteresting coat of paint on this, you could look at the way that like business models and apps approach this. They have these 3 stages. There's onboarding, where they're bringing new users in. There's habit building, where they're using techniques that ingrain their app or their process into a user's daily life. And then there's mastery, where the users are they know and understand and are kind of constantly using that app. And this is kind of boring, and I'm going to explain this in the scope of games instead. So let's just kind of slap some signs on this. Here we go. Early game, mid game, and late game. Early game is primarily what we're concerned with. That's when you're going to have a lot of players potentially coming in. And if we follow these arrows, kind of what this is trying to showcase is that some players are going to join your game and go through that early game introductory process. Some of those players are going to stop playing your game and kind of fall off from there. Some players, if your game requires building skill or something, some players are always going to remain at that early game skill level. What you want to be able to do is to engage players enough that they want to continue moving forward and progressing through the game and gaining skills or progressing through levels, whatever your game kind of requires, to lead players into the mid game. And at that point, you'll need different things to kind of keep them interested and invested. And you'll see similar effects where some people will get to the midpoints of your game and say, okay, well, I've decided this isn't for me anymore. They'll fall off and you'll lose those players. You'll also see some people that stay at that mid-game skill level and kind of explore and never actually follow through and finish the, let's say, full story that you've set out. And then, of course, you'll see players, again, if you're if you're engaging them properly and driving them forward through your design, they'll make it to the late game stage where they'll have completed the game, or they'll be doing kind of like those daily things. I guess if you're thinking about persistent games like MMOs, maybe late game is like doing the end game raiding parties and grinding late game gear and stuff. So this doesn't necessarily mean that they have finished the game, just that they're in a state of mastery of your mechanics and all the systems of your game. So that's kind of why this is important and why engaging users is important, so that we don't lose them, and to understand that we need different things at different phases of the game. And so let's kind of step back to this early game space and think about just like the first 5 minutes of play, because at that point it's really, really important for your players to understand why they should be choosing your game to play over another, or what you're doing that encourages players to come back and play more of your game instead of kind of dropping it and moving on to another piece of media or another game. And there's a lot of tropes for this, and it's just I have a couple that I've come up with that stick out in my mind as something that was memorable or interesting, or that I hadn't seen done in quite the same way in other places. Your experience might vary, but here's a couple things that stuck out as interesting for me in that first bit of gameplay. So the first thing I'll talk about is Saints Row 3. It's definitely an older game by now, but when I played it, it was extremely wacky. And in the very first mission of the game, we see the player character jumping out of an airplane. And what you're seeing in the picture here is they've jumped out of the airplane. There's all this debris that has also fallen out of the airplane. So you're shooting enemies and dodging obstacles while falling through the air. At some point, you fall into another airplane, fight your way through that, jump out of that airplane to save one of your companions. And that whole bizarre and strange sequence of events does a couple things. It sets up expectations for the player for what they can, again, expect out of a game like this, or out of this game specifically. And it also leaves the player, and certainly left me thinking, wow, this was completely ridiculous. What's going to come next? I have to keep playing this game so I can see what kind of bizarre situations I end up getting into. So that was the strength of this game's introduction for me. The next is not really specific to a particular game, but there's the old, RPG trope of you get an introductory quest of some kind, you leave the city to find whatever this thing is, like a piece of like some kind of remedy plant to cure someone's poison or something like that. You achieve this relatively small objective, and then you come back and find that, your starting city is in flames, or that one of your mentor characters has been killed while you were gone. And that kind of like pushes the character to move forward on some kind of more grand quest. And that's, again, that kind of like more immediate, let's say, crisis is one of the ways that some of these like longer form narrative games justify like pushing the player out into the world. So sometimes this is a quest for revenge, who knows? But this is kind of like one way that, or one other way, through maybe narrative rather than action, that games could involve players in their premise. And then there's games like BioShock, where the introduction is shrouded with mystery. Sure, there's some action in BioShock. For example, there's a plane crash at the very beginning, and the player is left stranded in the ocean, kind of swimming through all of these flaming pieces of debris. Going through that kind of basic movement area, the player finds himself in a lighthouse that is essentially like a portal to a society or a world that is really fantastical, and there's a lot of, again, intrigue and mystery surrounding this space. And in the case of BioShock, there's some minor horror elements as well, where the citizens of Rapture are very threatening to the player. And so giving the player some initial questions to ask, like, what is this? Where am I? What am I doing? Can be a way to involve them as well. Once you step through that initial stage and have your hooks in the player and say, okay, you want to play my game for a little bit, let's actually introduce you to the systems and go through the first few areas of play, or the first few phases of play. When you think about a typical play session in the early to mid-game, let's say, level of mastery, you think about, okay, well, there's other ways now that we have to keep players engaged, because we can't just keep adding more questions, or we can't just keep, kind of constantly ratcheting up the stakes of the action, because eventually you're going to hit a ceiling, or eventually you're going to have too many narrative questions that the players just, they feel no closure. So you can't use the same techniques the same way through. So looking at early to mid-game, typically this is when you'll be introducing players to new mechanics to build on that core experience that you're trying to provide. Once a set of basic mechanics have been given to the player has some understanding of them, you might then, through your game, have the players apply those mechanics in new ways, or have them explore things to build a level of challenge using the tools that they have and they know. On the narrative side, you can flesh out your plot lines, give players some answers to small questions, and make those things compelling. And of course, always, a way to always get players interested and engaged is to offer them interesting gameplay choices. And again, this is not a complete list, and we'll talk a little bit more about all of these things a little bit later. But this is kind of a brief introduction to get you aware of these kinds of things, or these possibilities, and be thinking about them as you're designing your games for Game Dev Workshop. So some examples. Adding new mechanics is pretty simple. Again, I've taken some screenshots from, pick your favorite Metroidvania, but here's Symphony of the Night, where the player is gaining gravity boots and they have a new way to explore the environment. You can look at the Mass Effect series, the way that they get players involved by building relationships between the player character and other characters on the spaceship, and kind of through that same kind of interaction, fleshing out the narrative structure of the game world, as well as giving some hints and insight into each character's own piece of story. But again, these techniques will take you so far, and are appropriate for certain parts of the game, right? This is kind of as players are ramping up, and there's still things to learn. There's still new elements to add. Eventually, players are going to progress through this early mid-game phase into late game and even sometimes post-game. And so once you're nearing the end of the plot of the game, how then do you keep players engaged? And is it important for you to do that? Sometimes in single-player narrative experiences, a player finishes the game, receives conclusion to the end of the story, and that's it, right? There's no impetus to kind of come back, and that's okay. And that's kind of one way to approach this. But when you're thinking about the late game, or if it's relevant post game, there's an understanding that once you're that far into a game, a player would have mastery of at least some of the systems and mechanics. And so this is kind of where, in let's say modern game design or game techniques, developers would think about things like content updates or structuring daily challenges. That's something that can be available from the beginning of the game. That doesn't really matter. But again, things that can engage people in late game once they have mastery are those kind of extra challenges, things like leaderboards, or even completion collectibles engage certain types of players. And a lot of these kind of ideas really apply as well to, as I mentioned before, MMOs. Once you've kind of reached max level in those games, those are the times when a player has mastery. So again, we're kind of thinking about this mess of garbage here, but really just the end game kind of rating process where you're grinding late game gear that you really don't need at this point, but it's fun to get new things. More on that in the rewards lecture, I'm sure. But it's not just MMOs that provide this kind of context. There's a lot of other games that do as well. Binding of Isaac and I think Spelunky were kind of some of the first in the door that offered daily challenges to their kind of like roguelike randomized style gameplay. So players could share scores and compete against one another that way. Completion collectibles are certainly one thing. Achievements can fall under that structure, but sometimes achievements also encourage players to play in different or interesting ways. Again, probably more on that later. Leaderboards, whether for scores or times or whatever else. And then, of course, the other thing that engages people once they've completed a certain portion of the game is additional content. If they're really invested in that world, they might be really interested in experiencing more of it. And so, the Borderlands games are pretty famous for having lots of additional content that gets added later, whether that's characters, but Borderlands 2 has, a couple story-based expansions as well. Mr. Torg's Campaign of Carnage, and so on. But really, the bottom line here is that whether you're thinking about the introductory stages, you're onboarding players, or those later game stages where you're trying to figure out how to add late game challenge or introduce new content in an interesting way or guide players to play in interesting ways, the bottom line really is keep things fresh for the players. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you can still have those really interesting set piece moments, your big epic boss battles or your crazy plot twists that are, kind of turn the narrative on its head. But what I think we need to start understanding is that we can't simply rely on these as the only interesting thing in the game. So today, or when you watch these videos, we're also going to be taking a look at tutorials and kind of how they integrate with those first few minutes of gameplay. And this is kind of why introductions are important to examine in first year. Because not only do we need to make sure that the player is interested in all of these things that I've just finished talking about, but we lump this together with tutorials because, as I mentioned at the beginning, a player really doesn't know anything about your game, including the specifics of how to play it. So teaching players is extremely important. And when a player doesn't have a good understanding of how to play a game, it's more likely that they're going to opt not to play that game just because they don't want to. They might feel confused or frustrated. So it's really important to explore how you can do that introduction and tutorial phase really well in order to get people involved and excited to continue playing your game. So I'm going to cut this video here, and I will record a second one with the basics of tutorials, and I will see you then.